If you've just gotten your first rental property under your belt and you're looking to lease it up, get it on the market, and find a great tenant, then this video is for you. This is my second video of this three-part series that tells you exactly how to get your first rental set up and the steps you need to take from getting beautiful photos and great listing copy all the way down through tenant screening and rent collection. In this video, I'm going to talk about what I think is the most important part of any rental process, which is tenant selection, tenant screening, and conducting tours with a new tenant. So let's go ahead and jump right in. At this point in the rental process, you've gotten your listing up for rent, you've identified how much you want to list it for rent, you have the copy, and now you're starting to get some applicants. This is awesome. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that we have qualified applicants who are applying for our rental and not just a tire kicker who's coming around to trying to waste your time or to see how cheap they can get the rent. So the first thing I'm going to cover in this video is how to actually have tenants apply for your new property. Now, there's a couple different ways to do this, and I usually prefer one way over the other because it's easier, it gives me more qualified tenants. But typically you can break this down into either a one or a two-step process for accepting applications for your tenants. So let's talk about the one-step process first, which is the one that I like to use better. In the one-step process, you just have only one option, which is for the tenant to apply directly. So when we say for the tenant to apply, we're talking about paying the $30 to get their background check and their credit check, actually submitting a real application with pay stubs, the whole 9 yards. Now, this does have some pros and cons, but overall, I like this method better. One of the benefits of having a one-step application process is that it helps to kind of weed out the people who are not actually serious about inquiring about your property. So the benefits of using the one-step application process for the landlord are that it's pretty straightforward, and a lot of the people who are just tire kickers are going to weed themselves out. So think about it yourself. If you're about to apply for someplace and it costs you $30, you're probably only going to apply to that rental if it really is something that you're interested in. So this is a nice thing. Now, one of the downsides if you're using this one-step method is because it does cost the tenant some money, you're not going to get as many inquiries. Now, this could be a good thing or a bad thing. You know, it's like, would you rather have more unqualified inquiries or less qualified inquiries? So it kind of is a wash, and it really just depends on what you like. Now that we've covered the one-step application process, let's talk about the two-step application process. One of my apps that I was using before, which is Rent Ready, they like to use the two-step application process, which is to have a pre-qualification first and then an actual application. So during the pre-qualification portion, you as the landlord can list the requirements that you have for your rental. So whether that's going to be income requirements, credit check requirements, background check requirements, if you allow pets, all these things are things that you can put in a little questionnaire that your potential tenant can answer. So all of these questions are going to be self-reported by the tenant, meaning they're going to fill out their own form and tell you basically whether or not they think that they meet your rental criteria. And then that is the first step of the process. So that pre-qualification allows you to do a couple of things. The first one is it allows you to pre-screen your applicants. So you get a lot of exposure. It doesn't cost the applicant anything to fill out this pre-qualification, and it can help figure out whether or not this tenant is going to be a good fit for you. You'd be surprised at how many people will fill out a pre-qualification even though they don't meet any of your listed rental qualifications. Honestly, it's kind of funny to see it sometimes, but it is helpful to be able to see almost like a little integrity check. You know, does the applicant actually say that they know that they don't meet your requirements, but that they're applying anyways? So it's kind of a give and take balance there. So one of the reasons why I do like this method also is that it allows you to do a little bit of a cross check. So when the tenant applies or when the tenant fills out this pre-qualification, they're going to state, I make this much money, I have this much, I have this much debt, I have this many pets, this is the number of people who are going to be living with me. And what you can do is once they actually apply, you can do a little cross check. You can kind of do a little mini integrity check to say, okay, well, did you fill out all the things on your application the same way that you did on your pre-qualification? Did you fudge your income just a little bit because you're worried that you may not make quite enough to get into my rental? These are all things that you can check for your tenant that give you another little method of verification for you as a landlord. So we talked about a lot of the pros for this method, but one of the major cons for this method of doing two steps in your application process is that it's just more admin, right? It's another form you have to set up. It's another form you have to go through. And then on top of that, you end up losing out on some of your leads. So some people will fill out the pre-qualification and then you go to have them do an application and they're just not interested anymore. There really is a balance between the one step or the two step. It really is just whichever fits your personality better. So now that we've found a potential tenant and we have a an application, or a pre-qualification, let's talk about the different forms you want to use for this applicant to make sure that you're covered as the landlord and that they're covered as the tenant if any liability or legal issues were to come up. So we've talked about a couple different forms so far. We've talked about a pre-qualification, we've talked about an application, but there's one more that we need to talk about, and that is the lease itself, right? So these are the three major forms that you're going to need if you're just at the baseline if you're going to rent out your property. The pre-qualification is going to be something that you can fill out yourself, and that's usually either a locally generated form, so something that you've just created, as a Word document that you have your tenant fill out, or it's something that's provided through an app like RentRedi. RentRedi makes it really easy to select which questions you want to ask on your pre-screening or your pre-qualification. So that's what I've used in the past when I go with that method. Now, the second form you're going to need, like we said before, is the application itself. Now, the South Carolina Association of Realtors does create a standard form that you're welcome to use. I think you can download it off your website, but if you can't, just shoot me a message and I'll be sure to share that form with you. But there is a standard application per the South Carolina Association of Realtors. Now, admittedly, in the past, I have not used this standard application because the websites or the apps that I use have had that application kind of built in, and it still includes all the same information. So for me, what I value is I would rather have an online application that's through the app because it makes it digital and it makes it easy to categorize and to keep for my records moving forward. So those are the first two forms: the pre-qualification, which is something you can make yourself, the application itself, which is either a state form or something maybe through the app. But the last part is the lease. Now, the lease is arguably the most important of all three of these documents because the lease is what protects you as the landlord and the tenant as well if something legally binding were to happen. Now, this lease is what's going to determine how long the tenant's going to be in there, whether or not they're allowed to have any pets. Speaking of pets, my cat. So whether or not they're allowed to have any pets, how much the rent is going to be, the late fee schedule, right? So the list goes on and on and on. And the lease is really the document that is going to outline all of those things. And because the lease outlines all those things, this is the document that you're going to sign with the tenant and that you absolutely need to keep a copy of. Do not lose this, because if you do, then all of your protections as a landlord, a lot of them go away. Now, when it comes to leases, there are a couple different places you can get those. Again, many of the apps that I'm using, they provide a lease form that you can use. There's also the South Carolina Association of Realtors lease forms. That is the one that I personally use because it's already been vetted through South Carolina state law, and I know for sure that it offers me and the tenant both some legal protection. Now, the third option for a lease is something that either you make yourself or that you contact an attorney to make for you, which is going to be a super customizable, very detailed lease. Honestly, I kind of think that those are overkill unless you have multiple rentals or there's something specific that you want to include in your lease. But otherwise, I just like using the South Carolina state forms because I hate to say this, but they're good enough for most small landlords to use without having too many problems. So now that we've talked about where to list your property, what forms you're going to need, and the different types of applications you can use, either a one or two-step process, let's talk about the most important part of any rental process, which is tenant screening. Now, this tenant screening process that I use is pretty thorough because what I've noticed is if you have a bad tenant, that is going to wreck your rental income and it could result in tons of damages. One of my friends, actually, his property manager didn't do a good job. And because the lease was very poor and the screening process wasn't done well, he ended up having $25,000 worth of damages after just 6 months of having this bad tenant in place. So if that doesn't tell you what you need to know, you need to make sure that you're screening your tenants properly. So let's jump into exactly how I screen my tenants and ways you can protect yourself. Before we go any further, when we talk about tenant screening, I have to put this disclaimer in here. Fair housing laws are real and they do apply anytime you're renting out a property. So for us in South Carolina, that means for fair housing laws, we do not discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, gender identity, or familial status, or if they have any handicaps. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to these fair housing laws, but again, I advise you to tread at your own risk because we always want to not discriminate against anybody because everyone deserves a fair place to live. So those exceptions are, if you are a small landlord, meaning you own less than 4 units, then you do not necessarily have to abide by the fair housing laws. The other scenario where fair housing laws may not apply is if you are the primary occupant of the house. For example, if you're living in one unit of your duplex and renting out the other side, in that scenario, you also do not have to abide by fair housing laws. That being said, I am not under any circumstances advising that you don't follow fair housing laws, right? I always make sure to maintain plenty of documentation and to not discriminate based off of any of those categories mentioned before. So now that that's all said, let's talk about the screening process itself. Now, when I'm screening a tenant, personally, while I do have 4 major areas that I'm looking, I also like to apply the whole person concept. Now, the whole person concept, right, it just is really a way of saying that there's not going to be one individual thing that is going to be a hard and a fast rule. So, for example, if a tenant has a little bit lower credit score, but they have a very high income, something like that, then I'm looking at the whole person, right? I want to make sure that this person is going to be a good fit, even if they don't meet each individual teeny tiny little bit of my rental criteria. So those 4 big categories that I'm going to check on are income, background check, credit check, and an eviction check. Now, those are the 4 big categories, and I'm going to break down each one and what we should look for so that we can make sure that we're making excellent decisions when it comes to renting out your property. So the first of the big 4 screening criteria is income. Now, this could be anywhere from 2 to 4 times your gross monthly rent, meaning however much money the person makes overall before taxes each month needs to be between 2 and 4 times what the rent is. Usually people go with 3 times the monthly rent as the base income. But for me, again, I'm willing to be a little bit flexible on this depending on a couple of different factors. For example, for me, the debt to income ratio is going to be way more important than whether or not they meet strictly that income being 3 times the rent policy. For example, if someone has 4 times the monthly rent, but they're just leveraged up to the gills with credit card debt or car loans or student loans or whatever it may be, that person is going to be way less appealing to me than someone who has 2 times the monthly rent but has 1 monthly debt expense, which is the rent itself. So you really have to kind of screen each person and look at their income in relation to their debt, not just as income versus rent. So that moves us into the second portion of my checks, which is a credit check. When it comes to credit checks, most people have a minimum credit score that they're willing to consider, and usually that's around 650. And keep in mind that credit scores can range anywhere from 300 on the very low end to over 800 on the high end, where 800 plus is like perfect credit, never missed a payment, have a long credit history. And in the 3 to 400s, that's like you just went through bankruptcy and you're insolvent, can't pay your debts. So a lot of landlords like to use 650 as a minimum credit score. I'm willing to drop down to 600, but again, it has to do with the other parts of their application. In my opinion, as long as they're above around a 600 credit score, they're probably going to be a safe bet. If they had a super great credit score and they have a very high income, they could probably buy a house anyways. And if a lender is willing to let them buy a house on their credit score, then I'm willing to let them rent my place based on that same score. Now, this is a quick note, but it is important. If you have multiple units for rent up at the same time and you set a minimum credit score, you need to apply that minimum credit score to all of your rental units, right? If you don't do that, that could be construed as a fair housing violation because you're starting to discriminate and kind of cherry pick, okay, well, this person can have a 600 credit score, but this person needs to have a 650. So you just need to make sure to have documentation and to keep everyone on the same level playing field. So when it comes to credit checks, after their credit score, the next big thing I'm looking at is their total monthly payment or their total debt to income ratio. Now, when you run a credit report, the credit report is going to show all of their outstanding debts and whether or not they're current on those debts. The big thing I'm looking for here are any red flags like a huge ballooning credit card debt that keeps going up and up and up over time, or any payments that have been missed, or some kind of other large debt that is either rising or not being paid off. Keep in mind that it is 2025, so most people are going to have some kind of either medical debt or student loan debt that they're paying over time. Again, the quantity of these debts is important, but as long as it's pretty reasonable, maybe $10,000 to $30,000 in student loan or medical debt, as long as they're making payments on that, that's a green flag for me. I'm okay with that. Now, the last part of a credit check is their payment history. This is the part that is arguably the most important part of the credit check, in my opinion. Personally, I want to see a 95% or higher on-time payment history. But again, I'm looking at payment history over their entire credit journey, not just in the last year. Even if their person's credit score isn't great, but they show a very, very high percentage or 100% payment history of on-time payments, then that is totally okay with me. This is kind of a sliding scale though. So for example, if I look at the person's credit and over the last 10 years, they have 1 missed payment and it was only 30 days late, but every other payment on all of their other debts is current or made on time, I'm not worried about that whatsoever. That is an A plus green check ready to go. Now, on the other hand, if I look in the past 2 years and they have 10 late payments and at least one or maybe more of those is past the 60-day late mark, that's going to be a huge red flag. And you can either require a higher security deposit or deny the person outright. So far, we've covered both the income and the credit check portion of our tenant screening. So now let's talk about the other half, which is the criminal background check and the eviction check. Now, the criminal background check and the eviction check, these are pretty straightforward, right? For the criminal background check, I'm looking for any violent crimes, any felonies, anything that's going to be basically a detriment to the neighborhood. Again, though, we're looking at the whole person. So if there is a misdemeanor for like unpaid parking tickets, or maybe if there's like a minor non-violent drug charge, right? Like I'm not really concerned with that type of thing. I'm looking for, again, violent crimes, sexual crimes, any felonies, right? Any breaking and entering, that type of stuff, because those are gonna be big red flags, and I will deny a tenant occupancy based off of seeing any of those things on their background check. Now, the last part is an eviction check. Again, typically, we don't want to see any evictions on a person's record. Now, from time to time, there's a weird rental situation where the landlord is doing a bad job and they're charging extra fees, or there's some extenuating circumstance where the tenant has an eviction filed for them, but the eviction is not processed or it's resolved somehow. So if that's the case, as long as I have a good explanation and I can verify the tenant's explanation, then I'm okay with going with a renter who has maybe an eviction that was filed, but that was never processed. Now, I understand that this is risky, and a lot of people are going to watch this video and probably give me a bunch of crap about accepting someone who has an eviction filing on their record. But again, I'm looking at the whole person, right? If this is someone like one of my tenants right now who has an excellent credit history, she's missed like one payment in the past 5 to 10 years. She has always been on time with her rent. And anytime that she wasn't on time with her rent, she can show proof that she's caught up. That's going to be a total green flag for me. I'm okay with that, because maybe that eviction happened a long time ago, or maybe there was some weird extenuating circumstance like a really aggressive landlord who files evictions left and right. You never really know, so it's just important to ask questions to make sure that you're seeing the whole picture and not just zooming in too far on one tiny portion. So here's the last part of my tenant screening process, and this is my secret sauce. So don't go telling anybody about this. But in addition to those big four, which are income, credit check, background check, and eviction check, there is one more thing I like to do. I like to ask the tenant if I can tour their current home. Now, that may sound weird, and it may sound probably a little invasive, right, of their privacy, but here's the basis. If you go into a tenant's home and it is totally a wreck, there's stuff everywhere, you can tell that they just kind of hastily try to clean up to make sure they don't look terrible when you come over to tour their house, that means that that's what your house is going to look like in about 6 months. On the other hand, if you go to tour this person's place and it's well kept, it's clean, it's nicely decorated, everything's up to code, everything looks really nice, that's going to be an awesome sign for you, because that means that your house in 6 months after they move in is going to look the same way, right? It's going to be in great condition. Now, I understand this can be kind of weird if you're going to ask somebody if you can just pop by and take a look at their house. But if you really want to see how they are going to be as a renter and a tenant, if you go and see what their current rental situation is right now, that's going to be the best indicator of exactly what your place is going to look like after about 6 months of occupancy. So we're reaching the end of part 2 of my 3-part series about how to rent out your first property. And in this part, we covered all about how to screen your tenants and how to lease up your place. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how to set up tenant tours, how to set up a lease and actually sign the lease, when to collect security deposits, when to hand over the keys, and touring the home before they sign.